the objectives for this session are to understand the definition of the term ethics in health research, outline the evolution of research ethics, recognize the need for adherence to ethical principles in health research, and describe the general ethical principles in health research. So this is what I will do, and after this, Rashmi and Dr. Animesh will take you through the components of the informed consent process, and then the roles and responsibilities of a researcher and the role of ethics committee in health research, the constitution and review procedures of the IEC, and also the clinical trial registry of India. So ethics, the word ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, and it means a set of moral principles. That the ethics is nothing but moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conduct of an activity. So the Oxford Dictionary says that it is the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles. So in research, what is ethics? In research, ethics is the set of rules or standards which govern the conduct of researchers during the planning, implementation, data analysis, data interpretation, and publication of the health research. So ethics is the standards that govern each and every stage of the research process. So why do we understand or study research ethics? So for those of us who conduct research or apply the results of the research findings, knowledge of ethics is vital. Only when we conduct a research study in a socially responsible way and conforming to the standards of ethics, the research will yield valuable results. Now, what happens when one conducts research that does not conform to ethical standards? It puts to question the entire research process. And so, there is no excuse for any work that is ethically questionable. So, whenever we conduct research involving human participants, the researcher obtains data through intervention or interaction with the human participants, or maybe or may not be, there can be identifiable human material or private information of the participant. Now, what are the types of human participation in research? So humans can participate in research as research subjects on whom experiments including testing of new drugs are conducted, as persons whose body organs or tissues are obtained or retained for research, such as blood, saliva, urine, biopsy specimens, any tissue or any organ, as research participants from whom information is obtained. So in the last couple of weeks, we studied on the tools of data collection, where we said we can collect data through observation, through interviews, focus groups, questionnaires. So whenever one participates in through these questionnaires or any form of research and we gather information, that also is subject to certain ethical standards. As people who might be identified in official documents. So when we do a research that involves employment records, a student's records, police records, court documents, or medical records. As people whose information, even if it is de-identified, whether identified or de-identified, is part of an existing unpublished source. So when the researcher is wishing to use all or part of an unpublished database obtained by another researcher for a different research project also, humans participate in a particular research project. Now, research involves striking a balance between two goals. Most of the research we conduct is aimed at advancement of science, understanding science better. The other goal of research is to protect the welfare of the subjects or the participants who take part in that particular research study. So the subject welfare and rights protection is another goal of research. Now, if you look at history, just to understand that how the yellow fever spread, they believed that it was a mosquito borne, and to confirm whether it spread through the mosquito, they conducted experiments in Cuba where they used soldiers and laborers. This study was conducted in vulnerable population, and most unethical standards were uh, used, wherein in spite of knowing that the subject participants are being exposed to a harmful virus, they were exposed. Next is the Nazi experiments. The Nazis conducted a series of experiments. Prominent among it is the cold water immersion experiment. Just to understand how hypothermia develops, what are the clinical features, and how to treat hypothermia, they conducted this cold water immersion experiment on prisoner camps. Next one is the Tuskegee syphilis study, wherein just to understand the natural course of syphilis, they conducted research on Afro-American. The blacks were used, and even after treatment for syphilis, that is penicillin was available, the study was conducted to know the natural course of the study of the disease. No. There have been other major violations to human research, wherein in 1963, the Jewish Chronic Diseases Hospital injected cancer cells into debilitated elderly populations to see if they would immunologically reject the cells. And the other one is the Willowbrook State Hospital in New York, where retarded children were deliberately infected with viral hepatitis just to study its natural history. There have been breaches in ethics, even in clinical trials conducted in India in recent years. In 2001, there was a clinical trial of a chemical with anti-cancer properties, which was tested for a US-based researcher among 26 unsuspecting cancer patients, of which 2 died and 1/3 became critical. Again, in 2003, more than 400 women who had been trying to conceive were enrolled without their knowledge or consent to take part in a clinical trial to see if a drug called letrozole induces ovulation. So there have been a lot of breaches to ethics in various research experiments that have been conducted over the years. So the earliest code or regulation that came was the Nuremberg Code, which followed the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazi war criminals were used for the trials. The prisoners in concentration camps were subject whom research was performed. After this, the Declaration of Helsinki came, which was developed by the World Medical Association, wherein the well-being of the research participant, it was declared that the well-being of the research participant should take precedence over the interests of science and the society. Subsequently, the Belmont Report came. Now, the Nuremberg Code emphasized on taking voluntary informed consent from the subject, and they said that any new research should be based on prior research in animal models, and there should be no physical or psychological injury. The benefits of the particular research should outweigh the risks, and the researcher should have experience, and the participant has a right to withdraw the consent, and the research must stop if there is any harm that results out of the study. However, this code did not have any mention of children, unconscious people, or others who may not be competent to give the consent. The next was the Declaration of Helsinki, which was based on the fundamental principle for respect for the individual, their right to self-determination, and the right to make informed decisions. Subsequently, we had the Belmont Report, which was based on basic ethical principles, which included the respect for persons, out of which the informed consent process came in. Then beneficence, that is, there should be maximum benefit and there should be minimal risk. And so beneficence and maleficence, non-maleficence, there were 2 principles, that is do no harm and do good. And then there was another principle that was called, that is justice, that is that there should be fairness of selection of subjects, and there should be procedures which are considered well prior to administration, and they're administered in a fair manner throughout the conduct of the study. So subsequently, we had various practices that have come in, prominent including the good clinical, the ICH guidelines and the good clinical practice guidelines which have come in. So the importance of the GCP and the ICH guidelines is that when we comply with these guidelines during a study, the rights and safety of human subjects who are participating in that study are not compromised, and trained staff manage the study appropriately. The study is carefully documented, and the protocol, the research protocol that has been prepared, will be strictly adhered to. Now, this is a timeline which depicts the evolution of various ethical guidelines. The latest guideline that we follow in India is the revised guidelines of the Indian Council of Medical Research. Now, research ethics is based on four cardinal principles, that is autonomy. Autonomy means that is, it is drawn out of the principle of respect for every human being, wherein due consideration needs to be given for the ability of a person to make informed choices and decisions. Beneficence means that whatever we do should be of benefit to others. Non-maleficence, that is do no harm, and justice, which involves fair selection of subjects and fair conduct of the study. So why should we adhere to certain principles of research ethics? We have seen that in the past, when I just told you about the history, that there have been unethical uh, studies that have been conducted, and what has happened, that is, there have been, because of these unethical practices, there have been devastating outcomes. So if there is no guideline, then what will happen? Human beings will keep on attempting immoral practices on vulnerable to determine outcomes, and this will lead to devastating outcomes, and hence it is necessary for ethical committee to approve all research in order to protect the vulnerable and protect human rights. Now, there are certain principles that guide research, and these include respect for human dignity, respect for free and informed consent, respect for vulnerable persons, respect for privacy and confidentiality, respect for justice and inclusiveness, balancing harm and benefit, minimizing harm, maximizing benefit. And so let us go into these principles in brief. First is human dignity, which is the cardinal principle, and it is the basis for all ethical obligation. There are two components of human dignity, that is the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends, and there should be a morally acceptable means to those ends. So it includes the protection of multiple and interdependent interests of the research participant. Next is the process of informed consent. That is, it is based on the principle of autonomy. That is, individuals have the capacity and right to make free and informed decisions. So any research should not and cannot proceed without consent, and the consent should be maintained throughout the research study. That means a participant who gives consent for a particular study today has the right to withdraw his participation at any time during the course of the research study. Now, any particular test on human beings should be conducted only if it is absolutely essential. So, we have to ascertain if all current available research has certified that if we are using a drug for a particular study or a new interventional procedure, we have to ensure, or we have to, the researcher has to first make sure if all current research certifies that the particular drug or intervention is safe. Now, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. So in research, we can have a group of vulnerable population, particularly pregnant women, people who are incompetent, that is, who are not in a position to give consent to participation, such as mentally challenged individuals, the pediatric population. So whenever we conduct a study on any vulnerable population, there should be a justification for including vulnerable population, and additional safeguards should be ensured for the vulnerable population. So we have ethical obligations towards vulnerable persons because, one, they have diminished competence and hence they have diminished decision-making capacity. So there should be special procedures to protect their interests. Based on grounds of human dignity, caring, solidarity, and fairness, vulnerable people are entitled to special protection against abuse, exploitation, and discrimination. Now, who are these vulnerable population? Now, if you look at the Tuskegee syphilis study, it was done on Afro-Americans. So racially, they were discriminated, and the study involved, there was no informed consent. The subjects and their families were put to risk. Vulnerable population, that is racially, they were discriminated. So they were exploited. There was deception. Information was withheld from them, and there was no benefit to the subjects, and this resulted in so many deaths and disability. So who constitute vulnerable population? Children, pregnant women, fetus, prisoners, refugees, mentally ill, people who are in emergency situation, domestic violence, poor people, economically backward classes, students, the uneducated, employees, elderly, addicts, institutionalized, and the homeless. So whenever we need to conduct a study in such kind of population, additional safeguards have to be ensured for protection of vulnerable population. So vulnerable population should not be exploited. Even other subjects who come under the non-vulnerable category, they may be non-vulnerable, but at any point during the research, anyone can become vulnerable. So there should be no exploitation of anyone throughout the research. Remuneration should be provided to the test subjects. Subjects who participate should be informed about all the potential side effects and risks, and ample compensation should be ensured for accidental injury that occurs during the course of the research, which may be in the form of insurance, rehabilitation, or lifelong support. Now, privacy and confidentiality are again principles that are fundamental to human dignity. So there should be standards that protect the access, control, dissemination of any personal information of the research participants. Now, when we ensure privacy and confidentiality, it helps to protect mental and psychological integrity. Now, we also have a need to inform our participants about the extent to which their personal info is going to be disclosed. As far as possible, one should not divulge identity and records of the test subjects. And we should not provide any information which will allow the identity to be guessed. The next principle is about justice and inclusiveness, which means that we have to ensure fairness and equality. The benefits of the research should be equally distributed to all. For example, if we conduct a research on genetics, it should not lead to racial inequalities. We should not conduct research on economically weak sections to create advantage for those who are better off. There should be no implicit coercion. So we should not enroll people at a disadvantage, such as prisoners, students, subordinates, or employees. So we should ensure that there is complete freedom of choice for joining the study whenever they are enrolled, as well as freedom of choice to exit the study during the study. Now, in a clinical trial, if we conduct a drug trial on a particular local study population, and that particular population cannot afford the drug or vaccine which is coming out after the trial, in spite of taking high risk of participation in that particular trial, it is not fair to conduct such a trial. So we have a duty that whenever we conduct a research, that research should be of benefit to others, and we have a duty to maximize the net benefits, and the benefits should be extended to the people who have participated in the research in a maximum way, also to other individuals, and there should be benefits to the society as a whole and for the advancement of the knowledge. We have a duty to avoid, prevent, and minimize the harm. So we should design the study in such a way that the risk to all subjects is minimized. Now, participation must be essential to achieving scientifically and societally important aims that cannot be realized without the participation of human subjects. Now, there should be a balance between the risks and the benefits. Balance is a critical thing to the ethics of human research. Foreseeable harms should not outweigh anticipated benefits, and hence it is our duty to perform a harm benefit analysis in order to protect the welfare and rights of the subjects who participate in the research. Now, the benefits, risks, burdens, and effectiveness of a new method that is studied should be tested against the currently available best prophylactic, diagnostic, and therapeutic method. Okay, so this is what is called as choice of control. Now, there is another principle called as clinical equipoise. So, when we are studying an intervention A or a drug A against drug B, there should be a genuine uncertainty within the scientific community about the comparative merits of both the interventions. So, if the uncertainty is not genuine, that is, we already know that intervention A is superior to intervention B, then such a study should not be conducted. So the uncertainty should be genuine about comparative merits of two interventions. So this principle is called as clinical equipoise. So there are two pillars of ethics in research. One is the informed consent process, and next is the institutional ethics committee. Now this will be addressed by Dr. Rashmi Jain. So with that, I conclude my presentation for today. If there are any questions, I will answer them at the end of the session. Thank you. I request Rashmi to please take over.
Yeah. So, thank you, Dr. Vijayalakshmi. I'll ask Rashmi to take over. And in the meanwhile, we have gone through the questions that have come in. And I'll just open the chat till Rashmi gets the presentation ready, so that for another minute or so till she gets it ready, we will have the questions if at all there are something which have to still come. So over to Rashmi.
So good evening, everyone. And now I move on to a very important part of informed consent. So this is something most of the researchers would be very well aware of, something which ethics committee keeps asking us about. So in this presentation, over a period of next 15 to 20 minutes, we'll just try and understand why are we talking about this informed consent? What's the ethical basis of it? What constitutes informed consent documents? We'll also talk about the characteristics of informed consent documents and some special circumstances in this entire process. Now, informed consent, what is it? Informed consent is a voluntary agreement between a researcher and a participant. Why? Because we would want a participant to participate in a research. Why are we taking it? Well, it's because everything in research or everything in ethics is about me. I would like to protect my freedom of choice. I would like a researcher to respect my autonomy. So when I say informed consent, we are talking about giving an individual his autonomy or respecting a human being for whom it is. Now, when I say this, what sort of a research requires informed consent? Well, like I said, you're talking about me, the human being. So any and all types of research which involve a human subject would require informed consent. All types, yes. It would be diagnostic research, a therapeutic research, interventional research, even the social and behavioral studies. So any research which involves me, the human being, whether it is me in my person or my thought process or my behavior or my attitude, anything you require to take an informed consent for it. Now, as per the Nuremberg Code, some basic essential qualities of a valid consent. The person giving the consent must have the capacity to give consent. The person must be acting voluntarily, and the person must have been provided with sufficient comprehensible information to make an enlightened or an informed decision. So the keywords here are capacity, voluntary, and something called as comprehensible information. What exactly are these? So let's go into detail of each one. Capacity. When I say capacity to consent, I mean two things. I mean that a person is able to understand the nature and consequences of the decision which he takes, and is also able to communicate this decision to the researcher. Now, who has the capacity to consent? Any person who is legally capable of making a decision. In our country, the age is 18 years. So that's a legal requirement for me to be able to give a consent. Now, if I am a participant, I need to give this consent. So capacity is of the participant. There can be situations where the participant has a reduced capacity. For example, mentally challenged, psychiatric population, a person is unconscious. In such situations, we have a term or we have a person who is known as a legally authorized representative, LAR. So if a person, a participant of the research is not able to provide the consent, in that case, this LAR is required to provide a consent. So any sort of incompetence, whether it is medical or whether it is legal, requires a LAR to give the consent. In such a case, if a legally authorized person is giving a consent, it is known as a surrogate consent. Okay, so now we go on to the second component, voluntary. When I say a consent should be voluntary, what do I mean? I mean a consent should not be obtained under duress, by coercion, by using force, by offering any undue inducement. So just because I'm a student of your class, you cannot force me to participate in a research. You cannot tell me, well, I'll make the surgery free for you. You cannot induce a participant by giving certain, benefits. Say, if you participate, I'll give you these things. That's not a voluntary thing. You're tempting, you're giving a person some reasons like inducement to participate in research. Now, clinical research, a very important thing. You're asking me to participate in research, but I as a participant am under the impression that this is a clinical research, a clinical treatment going on. This is called as a therapeutic misconception. What that means is that I believe as a participant that you're treating me, but what you're doing is you're conducting a research on me. So if you do this, it's not a voluntary consent. So all of these are a big no. Then what is meant by voluntary? Voluntary, give me choices. Give the participant a choice to not enroll in the study, to withdraw from a study at any point. I can say that no, I would not like to participate in your study. So if I as a participant understand that even if I refuse to participate in your research, it will not affect my right as a patient. It will not affect my any right in a relationship with you, then this is called as voluntary. So the term voluntary stems from a belief that you are letting a participant make his choices. Okay, so this is what is the next part, voluntary. Now, the most important part, sufficient comprehensible information. Now, this requires a disclosure from a researcher, a disclosure from the researcher to me, the participant, to understand and make an informed decision. How do we do this? We use something which is called as a patient information sheet, in which, in a simple language, which is easily understood by participant, we provide the information about research. We give the patient enough time, place, and privacy to clarify any concerns regarding this research. And most importantly, it's not just important to provide the information, it's important for a researcher to understand how much did the participant understand. So when we say comprehensible, it has two components, simple language and make sure you understand that or you test that your participant has understood the information provided by you. There are several ways to test this comprehension also. So now, if I just summarize this part, the elements of informed consent are disclosure of what I'm doing, various aspects of my research, understanding by the participant, voluntariness on the part of participant, and most important, the capacity of the participant to take a decision based on the information which the researcher has provided. So all of these are required. Now, we come to something which ethics committee very often uses. We often think it's just, signature, but informed consent for an ethics committee submission includes things called as informed consent documents or ICD. This has a participant information sheet where we are providing information to the research participant. It also has something which is called as an informed consent form. This is a form which is a document mentioning the contract or the agreement. So this is what we all often think or call it as a synonymous to our informed consent document. But please remember, informed consent document involve both of these things. Now, when I say comprehensible, simple, I am talking about a participant information sheet in a language which is understood by the patient. So now let's go on to some of the characteristics of a ICD. Now, 10 points on the left side of my screen are talking about the elements of ICD. This is something which should be present in all the informed consent documents. A statement mentioning it's a research. So this is not a treatment. This is a research. This is not a survey, it's a research. Why am I doing? The purpose of my research, the methods. What exactly am I going to do to collect the data? What is the duration of my research? Is it just a point in study? Is it a longitudinal study over 1 year or 1 month or 1 day? Frequency, how often does a participant need to come? And what methods am I going to use to collect the data on each visit? Next, I need to inform the participant what is his benefit for participating in my research. What is the benefit which my community gets? What is the benefit which anybody else receives from this particular research? Foreseeable risk. This foreseeable is a very important word. What this means is what risks, discomfort or inconvenience I can see in a near future. For example, a simple inconvenience may be that the patient who is coming or a participant who is coming needs to forego of his job for that day. The discomfort, my test procedure, these are the simple discomforts he may be facing. So whatever these are, now I cannot think of if there is a risk involved which is coming, which has not been documented, not there in review of literature. Well, it's not a foreseeable risk. So the things which I, the researcher, can anticipate should be mentioned in the document. Confidentiality of records. How am I going to maintain safety of the records so that everybody doesn't have access to it? Am I going to pay or give a reimbursement to the participant? The treatment and what is the compensation for injury, if any? And the voluntary aspect of it, that means the freedom to participate and withdraw from any longitudinal study at any point of time. Most important, identity of the entire research team and the people to contact in case of some problems. Additional elements can be things related to insurance, any stigmatizing situation, alternative procedures, and things related to biological material and data. When do I take the consent? Now, the timing of the consent, I should give adequate time for the participant to read, discuss with family, and seek clarification. Always the consent. Remember, before we decide to enroll a participant, we need to take the consent. And the consent is an ongoing process. It's not a point thing, it's an ongoing thing. For longitudinal studies, consent may be required at other times again during the study. Most important, after I do everything, I need to document what I have done. So documentation is an agreement or a contract. This means that the participant has understood and agreed to all aspects of my information. Name, date, time of the investigator, very important. We often forget this aspect. The participant or is LAR, or in case of an illiterate person, his left hand thumb impression. Signature of an independent impartial witness is extremely important. Now, waiver of a consent. Consent is always required for all research proposal, but there are certain situations in case the research does not have more than minimal risk, when participant and research are not coming in contact, or in case of emergency situation, a waiver of consent can be granted. But in such study also, privacy and confidentiality should be maintained. Now, the most important, the researcher needs to apply for this waiver. He cannot decide that I think this study requires a waiver of consent. Now, the ICMR guidelines talks about several conditions where waiver can be granted. Okay, so it's scientifically justified. Retrospective studies, if I have delinked or de-identified the participants only and they cannot be contacted. anonymized samples, certain public health studies if data is already in public domain, humanitarian emergencies, disasters, where a participant may not be able to give a consent. So what are the conditions? The researcher as well as the ethics committee is well aware of these situations. Sometimes the consent process is followed, but the written documentation part may be waived. Again, I or you as a researcher cannot decide this. This is only decided by the ethics committee when we apply for it. Reconsent, fresh consent, if there is a new information, change in any part of aspect, regaining of consciousness or competence of a person who was not able to give consent. A child becomes an adult, a long-term follow-up or extension is required. If there is a possibility that I'm publishing the research and it requires me to disclose the identity, of course, things should be in place to ensure that we camouflage all of this. But still, if we feel that the identity may be disclosed, then we need to take a reconsent. The partner or a spouse may also be required to give additional reconsent in some of these cases. So this part, after taking a consent, if I need to take a fresh consent, is called as reconsent or fresh consent. Again, this has to be again told and informed to the ethics committee. Now, what happens after we take the consent? Well, we need to give a copy of the patient information sheet and the signed informed consent form to the participant. If, very important, if the participant says, I don't want to take this documents, no issues. But then I need to record this reluctance of the participant. I must make all the attempts to give the document copy to the participant. Now, whose responsibility to obtain the informed consent? Normally, we only think it's my responsibility as an investigator. But no, there are several responsible parties in this. The sponsor, the person who is funding the research, they are responsible for the preparation of these informed consent documents, for translations. Often we go to Google Translate, but it's not always the correct way. So a good, correct, authentic translation is to be done, and the sponsor is responsible for doing this. Monitoring of any of the whole process is also the responsibility of sponsor. The investigator, he needs to prepare the documents. He needs to be ensuring that translation is correct and done, and monitoring of this thing. IEC, it's responsibility of the ethics committee to ensure verification of the content and that everybody adheres to the guidelines. And they are also responsible for monitoring this informed consent process. Finally, the most important, the volunteer or the person who's going to participate in my research, does he have a responsibility? Yes. It's very important that he behaves responsibly and understands the content of this process. He should sign only after reading and understanding this thing. So he cannot say that I did not read it. Just like an investigator cannot say, I did not think I should have taken his signature. So each person is equally responsible. Now, we come to some special circumstances. Surrogate consent. We have already spoken about this. When the participant cannot provide the consent, then a surrogate consent comes. Active and passive consent. You must have heard of researchers where, for example, a researcher goes to the school and gives a document saying that, well, if we would like to enroll your child in the study, please return this document, then we can enroll. That's an active consent. Sometimes the researcher mentions that we will enroll or we will come and do this particular study on the child, we'll do a health checkup. If you do not want your child to participate, please return this back. So that's a passive consent. So these are active and passive consent. Other things such as, let's move on to electronic consent. Now, electronic media can be used to provide information related to various aspects of the study. Electronic media can also be used to document a consent. It can be used to take a assent or a consent from a participant or a LAR. That's a legally authorized representative. All of these come under the category of electronic consent. Various and multiple electronic formats can be used, such as a text, a graphics, audio consent forms, video consents, podcast, interactive websites. All of these are various modalities of obtaining electronic consent. Online consent may be obtained. in researches involving sensitive topics while safeguarding information and the data. Sometimes it can also be used in regulatory clinical trials. Now, how do I obtain this electronic consent? Whatever I am doing, the process, the electronic material, the method of documentation, electronic digital signatures, the method used to maintain privacy of participant, I'm not going to reveal who it is, the confidentiality of data, whether my electronic data is safe, what is the system which is collecting this data, the policy of the data users, everything should be reviewed and approved by ethics committee. It must contain all elements of informed consent. It must be supervised by the PI, and if required, a paper or a soft copy may be required for archiving or given to the participant. Interactive formats should also be simple to navigate. Okay, and now we go to deception study. As Dr. Vijay Lakshmi mentioned, deception is not a correct way of doing study, but sometimes it may be required because of nature of the research design. In such cases, the information, complete information may be withheld before we complete the study. A review and approval taken from ethics committee, and very important, attempt should be made to debrief the participant or community after completing the research. Community consent. Gatekeepers of community, heads, leaders may be giving this consent. This consent may be obtained in writing or audio or a video recorded consent on behalf of a group. Organization should be representative of the community like a village panchayat, and the quorum of such committees must be met. Individual consent is important even when we obtain a community consent. Institutionalized individual, they themselves need to give the consent, or a LAR on their behalf can give a consent, but it's very important to obtain a permission from head of that institution wherever we are conducting this research. Children, so important to protect the right of the children as they are vulnerable. Children, now we need to obtain something known as assent from a child who is in the age of 7 to 18 years. And along with this assent, we need to obtain a consent. In case of research involving children, the verbal consent can be taken from 7 to 12 years, and 12 to 18 years, a simplified written assent should be taken from the participant. When a parent or a LAR consents to let their child participate, but if a child refuses, we need to respect the right of the child. We cannot do research on the child. The consent from a parent or a LAR can only be waived in special cases such as child abuse, or when the intervention can be life-saving for the child. So that's about protecting the right of a child. So with that, I come to end of this part about what is exactly informed consent and what are the various parts of informed consent document. I will take the questions at end of the presentation, and now I hand over to Dr. Animesh to take us through ethics committee and the various regulatory requirements.
So thank you, Rashmi. We'll start with the presentation that I have, and we will have all the questions at the end. We have taken note of some of those questions that you have already put up, and we will take all the questions in the end. So let me start with the presentation, and we will go through some of these things. So ethical issues in research, a brief introduction to ICMR guidelines, 2017, which are the latest, then also about IEC and the Clinical Trial Registry of India. So we will be dealing with these topics in my part, and the outline is ICMR guidelines 2017. The salient features I'll just touch upon because this itself cannot be done in such a short duration. Yeah, similarly, I will. Yeah.
Animesh sir, the share screen is not there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Praveen. I'll just go through. All right. It's there now, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's visible, sir. Now it's there.
All right. Thank you, Praveen. Sorry, I forgot to share. Right. So we are going through these topics, as I said, and we will go through the ICMR guidelines 2017, just briefly the salient features, the composition and the review process in the IEC, I will just touch upon, just to give you a idea of inducement versus compensation. I will tell a few things which researchers should do, their responsibilities, and I will go through the Clinical Trials Registry of India just to sensitize you about what it is and what is like required from our side. And then we will end with take home message and then summarize and then take questions. So as you are aware, 2001 itself, we had the Indian GCP guidelines. And the ICMR guidelines, the current guidelines were formulated and launched on 12th of October 2017. But before that itself, we had 1980, we had the first guidelines of ICMR for ethical guidelines for human participation. Then 2000, and for a long time, we were using the guidelines which were formulated in 2006. And now we have the 2017. So let's look at this. Now, these guidelines are actually available online, and you can download it free of cost as a PDF from this ICMR site. If you don't remember anything, just go to Google, ask for this ICMR guidelines 2017 for human participation or human research, and you will get this. And you can also get a hard copy, but that costs you 500 rupees. So it's always better you can just have a soft copy, or you can print out from a soft copy. Now, where is it applicable? It's applicable to all kinds of research that you will do on any biomedical, social, behavioral science research for health, and which is conducted in India, which involves human participants or their biological material or even their data. So for example, you are taking any data from me or about me, that is also under this purview. You're taking any kind of sample from me, that's again applicable. So that's the scope of this. And if you see this, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who is the chief scientist of WHO now and former, the DG of ICMR, she's talked about this, and she said that this guidelines actually encompass lots of things which were earlier not available in our guidelines in India, including things like public health research, disaster and emergency related research, behavioral research, and even research on vulnerable populations, or even conducting collaborative research. So these guidelines touch on everything, including there's a section of even responsible conduct of research, and it's very well laid out. And I would suggest for all of you who's involved in doing some kind of research, I think you must have a look at it, and you should have it as a ready reference available to you. So just to tell you, it's organized in 12 sections. It has sections and subsections sequentially numbered. So there's a continuity, and you can always refer to each of them. If I want to communicate to you that this is in this particular play page or this particular section, it becomes very easy. Similarly, as I said, there is a section 3 on responsible conduct of research. And then there is a section on social behavioral research, which is in section 9. And very nicely and neatly organized in the form of boxes and tables. I'll show you some of the boxes that I've taken in this presentation from this guideline. And there are tables. So just to give you an idea, these are the tables. So you have all the ethical issues, the ethical review procedures, the vulnerability, types of reviews, clinical trials of drugs and other interventions, and classification of medical devices. So all that, and even types of samples and biological materials. So all this is there in this particular guidelines. Now this talks about research related harm, because that's very important for us to determine, especially for ethics committee when they review. So for research related harm, under this ambit comes everything which can be quantified as a direct physical, psychological, social, legal, or economic harm, or a combination of any of these things as a result of participation in any research. So sometimes if there is just a question of research, but it might cause a psychological trauma to me, it might hurt me, or it may lead me to depression. So that also will be under this. So that's why it's required that we need to understand that it's not just merely physical. It can be social stigma related to that. So that could come under this ambit of purview. Entitled to compensation, financial or other assistance after due assessment, obviously. So if any related harm is there because of research or taking part in research, and the worst being the death, obviously, prior to this maybe coma or if not direct death. So death also entitled to financial compensation. A research proposal should have an inbuilt provision for mitigating research related harm. So any proposal that where we can think that there could be a harm. Many a times there may not be, or there would be minimal or less than minimal risk. But if you think or foresee that there could be, even if it's 1,000, 1 in 10,000 or whatever, you need to have an inbuilt provision. And this is very clearly put up in these guidelines. And that's again one of the beauty of this guidelines, that they have put up this. Somebody was asking a question about SAE, serious adverse events. So again, researcher is responsible for reporting all serious adverse events to the ethics committee within the 24 hours, and including non-working or holidays. And this has to be done. And then once that is done, after that, within 14 days, they have to find out and see to it whether this serious adverse event is related to the research being conducted or not, and a report of the same has to be submitted to the ethics committee within 14 days. So that's again the important thing that has to be done. Now, what does the IEC have to do? IEC has to review the relatedness of the serious adverse event to the research and determine whether it falls under that or not. Then based on that, they have to determine the quantum and type of assistance to be provided to the participant. Okay, so whoever has suffered that, and all adverse event cases, whether related or not. Now, I'm talking about even if it is not related to the research, they should be offered appropriate medical care, which is a duty of healthcare professionals. So since they are participating, obviously it becomes a kind of duty. Psychosocial support, referrals, clinical facilities, etc. Of course, within its own limits. Medical management should be free and compensation should be given if the harm is definitely related to the research. And IEC should also consider type of research depending on that, whether it is interventional or observational, and then the type of injury, whether it's a temporary injury, whether it's a permanent injury or a short term or a long term, does it lead to loss of wages, any other kind of things. So based on that, they will give compensation. Now, who should? If it's a sponsor trial, so sponsored trial, sponsor is responsible and they have to give. If it's an investigator initiated research or a student research, now let me qualify this before I go in further. Now, for example, I start a research. It could be related to my interest, it could be because of my academics, it could be because of my whatever other interest in my career. That is an investigator initiated research. Similarly, a postgraduate thesis or any undergraduate or any other research is also investigator initiated research until unless it's funded or initiated by a sponsor. So it is investigator initiated. Now in that case, please remember, as per the new guidelines ICMR 2017, the host institution is held responsible. So they have to provide compensation and or cover for insurance for research related injury or harm to be paid as decided by the ethics committee. And there is a formula for that. I'll not go into details of that. Now, having said that, most of the institutions don't have a mechanism. So they advise that there should be a mechanism created, that is inbuilt mechanism. And they say that can be done either by having a corpus fund generated, or they can have budgetary provisions or whatever. Or otherwise, if you're applying for funding agencies, grants and all, so then you make a budgetary provision for insurance coverage or compensation as well. So this is what is the recommendation in the new guidelines, which is again new. And based on this, in fact, some of you might be aware, many of the PG theses are not now being allowed to have some kind of clinical trials, or they are being converted into observational or at least quasi-experimental kind of studies. And that's one of the reasons, because nobody wants to, and especially the institutions don't want to risk this. So that is one of the things. Now coming to inducement. Now, participants may be paid for the inconvenience and time spent and should be reimbursed for expenses. But if it is reasonable, that means if I'm calling somebody and if they lose wages, or that day's wages I provide some for transport, maybe a little more for their refreshments and things like that, and maybe I provide the 3 months or 6 months of some medical benefits, some benefits to them, that's fine, that's reasonable. But if I do it unreasonable, if I do it disproportionate, that might lead them to get induced, or they might get enticed by it. They might feel that, okay, let me participate because I'm getting so many benefits, which is disproportionate. So that becomes a kind of inducement. So only compensation is allowed. As long as it's reasonable, it is compensation. The moment it transgresses that boundary, it becomes inducement. And that again, ethics committee will look into. It's very much within their purview to look into if you're providing some incentive or whatever, whether this is reasonable or not. Just a word about conflict of interest. What is it? Now, many a times we have different kind of situations, or many a times we wear different hats. Now, one of my hats, one of my role conflicts with another, or a professional judgment concerning a primary interest, like welfare of the participant, validity of research, any other thing, is unduly influenced by my secondary interest. Now, what could the secondary interest? Secondary interest may be financial or non-financial, like a personal gain, academic gain, political gain, settling some scores, anything. So if that gets influenced, then again, that is a conflict of interest. Now, there is nothing wrong, no inherent wrong in this, but there could be an influence of this conflict of interest on the choice of research question and my methods, or my recruitment or retention of participants, or interpretation of my results, or publication of data, or ethical review of research. So that's why if there is a chance of conflict of interest existing, it's always good that the researchers must disclose it. And as long as possible, you should disclose that this could be potential conflict of interest, which I see. And EC is also that ethics committees must evaluate each study in the light of any disclosed interest, or if they foresee any, they should question that. At the same time, if there is a member, when there is a conflict of interest, for example, he or she who's a member of the ethics committee and is a part of that protocol also, then again they should declare, and ideally that member should actually step out during the discussion of that protocol and then come in only after the decision is made. So that is again something like conflict of interest within the ethics committee itself also, one example. Now, after the research is done, we should not just leave those participants to fend for themselves. As far as possible, and especially for chronic illnesses and other things, we should give continued support and give better care to the participant, because it's our responsibility. Now, that brings me to the next part, that is the IAC composition and review procedure, roles and responsibilities. I'll not go into much. So every institution ideally should have a committee, institutional ethics committee. And this is done by the head of the institution, which appoints that committee and then puts it in place. Now, ideally, it should be at least 7 members and up to a maximum of 15 members as per the ICMR guidelines as well as CDSCO requirements. It should be a multidisciplinary, a multi-sectoral composition with both gender represented. It should have medical people, non-medical people, scientific and non-scientific people, including laypersons, including people from religious background and lawyer background. So I'll just show you. And as I said already, that age, gender, all those variety of people. Okay, there is a chairperson, a member secretary. Chairperson is always an external person, will not be from the institution, but the member secretary is always from the institution. So if my institution constitutes it, then chairperson will be from some other institution. It could be neighboring or any other institution, but not my institution, not my university, ideally. So member secretary will be from the same institution. Then alternate members can be there sometimes, because if you think that some people may not be able to make it, so you can have. You can also have subject experts if you foresee that some of these protocols may come and you don't have members who have that expertise. So you can have a list of them, and depending on when you receive protocols, it can be directed to them. Sometimes they might be even called for that particular protocol review, and they might have to go out after that particular. And then they have to undergo, all the members should undergo training and continuous training as well. So this is the layout of the composition of the IC. If you see, you have all kinds of members, including legal experts, social scientist, or a non-governmental agency person representative, then a philosopher or an ethicist or a theologian, and one or more layperson. Now, what is this layperson? Layperson is usually a person who will represent the community. Ideally, they say this person should not have, at least for the last 5 years, should not have been into the medical profession or science profession or anything like that. So that's something like that. So minimum 5 years, and then ideally it should be a person who's engaged in social kind of responsibilities and social commitments, ideally. But at least if not, he should be a person who represents the community and has not participated in any of these scientific or medical practice for at least 5 years. Now, as I said, 7 to 15 members. Again, the other thing is at least 50% they say advocated that there should be external members. And to have a quorum for this committee to meet, minimum 5 members are required, both non-medical and medical, scientific, non-scientific, and at least preferably a layperson should be there. So if there is no quorum, any of the decisions taken are not valid. So that's again one of the things. When the ethics committee meets and reviews the protocols, what do? So they review the protocols, and what kind of protocols? All research proposals on any biomedical, social, and behavioral science research has to go through this ethics committee review. As a researcher, as an investigator or a team of investigators, it's my responsibility to submit it to the ethics committee. Even if I want a particular concession, or say, for example, waiver of informed consent or any other thing, I need to apply to ethics committee, request them, but I cannot take a decision like that, as Rashmi also told you. And then the ethics committee will also continually, regularly monitor the approved research. Now, please remember, many a times people come up, they say, why is the ethics committee looking into the scientific aspect? So scientific review, usually good ethics committee have a two stage. So there's a scientific review committee, and then it goes to the ethics committee. But please remember, in spite of that scientific review having been happened, ethics committee must determine that the research methods are scientifically sound, and should determine and examine the ethical implications of the chosen research design. And if they find something, they can always question, or they can ask for review. So they can do that. And it's very much within their purview, as per any guidelines, including ICMR and CDSCO. Now, every EC should have written SOPs, which will be in line with all the guidelines which are proposed by these regulatory bodies. And then they may have subcommittees. If there are stem cell proposals which happens in some institution, they can have another committee for that. And what do they look at? They look at all these things like ethical issues related to social values, benefit risk, scientific design and conduct, selection and recruitment of participants, if there is any inducement or compensation or any payment, so whether this falls under the compensation or inducement, protection of privacy and confidentiality, which has been touched upon by earlier speakers, if there is any community consideration to be taken care of, the informed consent process itself, what kind of consent is it being happening correctly, disclosure of conflict of interest as it happened, qualification of researcher. Now again, whether the researchers are qualified to take a particular research, like for example, me coming from community medicine background, I cannot be a principal investigator in a cardiology trial where I have very limited knowledge. So I need to understand that. So I can be a co-PI, I can be a co-investigator, but not a PI definitely. Okay, so co-investigator or part of the team, yes. So I need to have that caliber, and then plan for medical management and compensation. So these are the angles they look at. Now coming to review procedure, some of the times chairperson and member secretary, being their own expert in their own fields, they can have dual roles. So member secretary, suppose, is a medical scientist, or suppose is a pharmacologist, so can also double up as a pharmacologist. So like that, chairperson is a pediatrician, so can also become a clinician in the board. Types of review, there could be 3 types of reviews: exempt review, expedited review, and a full review. Let's look at this briefly to give you an idea. Now, basically, whenever you put up, the committee will decide what kind of this review it fits in. And usually the ethics committee office receives it, and the ethics committee, the secretary of the ethics committee will look at and then decide on that based on the protocol. A quick review, or maybe 1 or 2 members he will take into confidence and do that. So exemption, when is it exempted? So protocols that have less than minimal risk, or where there are no linked identifiers. And there are some examples given, like research conducted on data available in public domains. For example, I want to take up something which is there in census website, and I want to do something. Or there is National Family Health Survey. So I take data from there and I want to do some compilation and conduct some kind of analysis and come up with result. So some kind of that. Or reviews and meta-analysis. Somebody was asking about systematic review, so that's there again. So this may be exempted. It can be put up, but generally may not be, because usually you're not conducting any kind of say confidential or private data, and hardly any risk. Okay, all these quality control, quality assurance. Now, what is expedited? So all those proposals that do not have any kind of previous kind of thing, so then they fall under this. So they have no more than minimal risk, but they have some risk. Okay, so they will fall under this. So this is like, again, some kind of, I've given you some examples, including research involving non-identifiable specimen and human tissue from sources like blood bank or tissue bank and leftover clinical samples. And again, all these, though I'm saying, and these are the guidelines, but it's under the purview of the particular ethics committee to decide whether they fit in this or wherever else. And it's their decision which finally holds. So this is what the committee will look into. And then full review is for all those which are more than minimal risk and which are not covered in the previous two categories. So they will be subjected to a full review. So the study, depending on whatever type and the question and the methodology, the committee will decide. And as I said, though we may have these examples and categories, it's very much the prerogative of the ethics committee and its members and the chairperson and secretary to decide where does it fit in. So it can vary. And it's also possible that one committee decides on something, but the other committee has different views. So it can be different in different contexts and cultural contexts and things like that. What are the types of decision? Now, a committee, after going through the proposal, will decide whether it is to be approved or there is a minor modification or amendment required. So they will inform in written, or major modifications and resubmission, or not approved. Please remember, not rejected, it said not approved. So usually that's the terminology. Now somebody was asking about what if we don't have an ethics committee. So there's a provision, utilizing the services of an EC of another institution. So that again, you need to have an MOU in case like you have a neighboring or any other institution and you don't have. Again, depends on those two institutions. That means the institution which has ethics committee, whether they want to enter into such a MOU or not. So they need to have that, and also have no objection certificate from the user institution. So all that has to be done, and then they can go through that. Many a time, some of the institutions, what they do is they also say that since we cannot always monitor that, so you might have to have a co-investigator from that institution coming on board and things like that. So there are things like that available. I'll just touch on that and leave it at that. Now we've also looked at these things now. So why ethics committee, what type of research, which studies? So all studies, including record-based studies. Okay. So we have to have everything reviewed, types of reviews and decision. But please remember one very important thing, no study should be started prior to IC approval. It has to be approved and then only started, including a questionnaire or a Google form research. That's something which is like misconception, but let me clarify it here, that you should not start any study prior to IC approval. And then if you're making any change, you need to inform the IC again. And then that will not probably go for an entire procedure again, but then you need to, and they will immediately, depending on the ethics committee, usually they will just issue a letter, okay, your thing is accepted, and then again another letter that, okay, from this date, your change in protocol is accepted. A word about Clinical Trials Registry of India. So what is it? It's a free and online public record system for registration of all kind of clinical trials, including PG thesis and other biomedical research which is being conducted in our country, India. Okay, so CTRI is Clinical Trials Registry India. It's linked to the WHO registry, World Health Organization registry, and it was launched way back in 2007 by ICMR. However, it's not taken up so well and not many people are aware. So now they are making it more, awareness drives and things like that. Not only that, another thing which has happened is now it's become mandatory, and from 1st of April 2018, only prospectively you can register these trials here. Earlier we could do retrospectively or even ongoing trials, but now from 1st April 2018, there was a window period before that, but after that, no trials which are already started or have been completed can be registered, and it's mandatory as per the CDSCO. This is how the web page looks, and this is the URL, ctri.nic.in, National Informatics Center. It's linked to that particular domain. So this is the homepage. It has an IC tutorial and things like that, even nice FAQs just to give you an idea. And then you might ask me, is it mandatory to register my purely observational study? Only clinical trial, you said. See, please remember that red thing. When in doubt, register. And there's nothing like you cannot register or observation or any other kind of study. You can. Clinical trials, it's mandatory, but any other trials also can be done. And as I said, from 1st April 2018, CTRI will register only clinical trials prospectively. That means before the enrollment of first participant. Again, let me also tell you, for CTRI registration, one of the things which is mandatory is your ethics committee approval. So if you do not have that, you will not be able to register. So it's important that you go through the ethics committee and then get that approval and then start doing this. What type of studies? All kinds of clinical studies, if you look, including all the traditional medicinal systems, including the postgraduate thesis, can be registered and also registered. Okay, including all kinds of interventional, observational, bioavailability, BE and BA studies and post-marketing studies, everything. Now, please remember, it's mandatory. All kinds of trials being conducted in India should be registered with CTRI. Okay, so if it is registered somewhere else also, but still if you're doing it in India, you must register. Now, then you might think that can it be like, duplication because 2 or more registries, then it will be like probably separate trials as counted as that. Now, please remember, if you're doing that and if it's a multicentric or if it's a sponsored trial from somewhere else which is registered, please quote the primary or other registration number which is there and partner registration number. So then automatically it will be identified because these are linked. Okay, there are about 13-15 registries, all are linked, and that can be done. Now, all clinical research which involves human participants with any kind of these, including Ayush, let me say that very emphatically, so that has to be registered and can be registered. But clinical trials also have to be registered. And what does it do? It helps in improving transparency. Let me also tell you that many of the journals now insist on this, including Medno group of some journals, which say if you have a CTRI number, if not, you cannot actually go ahead and publish. And some of the good conferences have also asked now that whether it was registered in some trial register. CTRI in India, definitely. So that's also important. Now, a word about researchers' responsibility. As a researcher, it's a duty of the researcher or the team of investigators to protect the human participants, conduct research according to the universal ethical principles, some of which have been touched upon today's presentation, use the best possible scientific methods because bad science is bad ethics. Similarly, you cannot have a good ethical thing if you do not have good methodology. Obtain appropriate informed consent, and that's also been alluded to. Respect the confidentiality, and then conduct research according to protocol that meets local needs, because many times the cultural and appropriate contexts are important. Ensure compliance with the ethics committee requirements. Provide an agreed treatment or assistance that you have already promised. If you are having a community or a group of participants, support their long-term interests and apply and share the knowledge once you have completed research. That means you must present in conferences. You must present and publish your research, because there's no point if you gather data, analyze, and keep your report just to yourself or in the library. It needs to see the light of the day. It needs to be shared with the scientific community, and that's how the science progresses. So that's also one of the researchers' responsibility, and it's also ethical that we do share our knowledge so that there is a peer review, there's more dissemination and things like that. To summarize, I have already touched on certain things. So I have touched on the Institutional Ethics Committee's compositions, its functions, the review procedures. I've tried to give you an idea about the Clinical Trials Registry of India, researchers' responsibilities, a brief on that. Now it's question time. I know some of you have already put in questions in the chat. So we will take some of those questions, but otherwise, if you would like to reach me out, I have just put up my details as well, and we will now open it for questions. So with that, let's open it for questions.
Open. Animesh?
Some of the questions that, yeah.
There is a question on what is the difference between an information sheet and an informed consent form?
Right.
So, yeah, let us.
So
okay, you can take the question.
I have already seen that question. I have already jotted that, so I will just take that and tell you. So this was a question about that, information sheet, and so see, please remember when Rashmi talked about, she said that informed consent documents. Now, please remember, informed consent documents consist of participant information sheet and the informed consent form. So these two things together make it. So participant information sheet outlines all the things that are there for you to know about the study, including what are your rights, who to contact in case of something happens, what are the procedures, everything. So that's the information, participant information. Okay, and that's the information. And then the consent form also gives you briefly, but also tells you that you have read it, you have had the opportunity to clarify and things like that, you understood everything, and you're willingly and voluntarily taking part, and then you sign that, and then that becomes a documentation of that. So that's partially answered already in the presentation, but just to clarify. There was also a question about the institutional ethics committee getting registered with ICMR or like. There was a question from Srividya. She had a series of 4 questions. I've already responded to her personally, but just to tell you, there's a process for the same, and I can't go into this detail of that because there's a whole thing which we need to discuss. But there are guidelines available. There's an online registration process nowadays, and then you can further, if you want, you can even go for accreditation from SIDCAR as well as AHRP, which is which are the guidelines available. And then if you fulfill all the requirements, and they will visit site and do trainings and things like that, so that can be done. I think I've answered that question from.
Okay, there's a question on our language translates always.
Yes,
essential?
I was coming to that.
Yes, it is essential. And one thing we need to make sure is whatever we write in the participant information sheet regarding the study for information to the participant is free of jargon. It should be in as simple language. And in our university, our ethics committee always, they tell us that the language should be so simple. If a class 8 student reads it, also should be able to understand what is written, communicated in that participant information sheet. So this is about that. And vernacular translates are essential depending upon the category of participants that you are involving in your study.
Yes, even I had responded to that, saying that depends on the research question, methodology, and the population involved. So if my population, say for example, if I'm doing it here and if I have 3 or 4 language people, yes, I will have to go for that, and all those have to also be presented. There was another question about if the study is not experimental in design, is the ethical approval required? Yes, as I told you already, that every study has to go through, so it's not necessarily only for experimental design. Then I've already answered about that systematic review. Generally you may not, but again, if you really are in doubt, it's better to put up. But otherwise, if you're not taking any personal data, confidential information, because you're actually reviewing the published papers usually in systematic review and meta-analysis. So usually the guidelines don't really say that you must have to, nor there is a risk for any participants. Then the other thing is about one more question from Deepthi. Can we get ethics committee approval outside the medical college, and how valid is it? I've already touched on that in the presentation, I think. Yeah. So reporting of SAEs also I have touched upon. What are the other questions? Let me just see. And
there is somebody. There's somebody who asked me whether, since they are working in these private hospitals or private clinics, and they have their own clinics. Now, what about the data which they gather in their private clinics? What about the ethical clearance for such data? It is required that it is reviewed by some independent ethics committee. You just can't you conduct a research without a ethical review process.
But not, it's not.
Any other question, Vijay? I'm just going through some. I saw one question that if there is like data collected from another institution, can we have ethical issue? So I don't know what exactly this question means.
Is she talking about multicentric studies? If you have multicentric studies, then whichever center is involved, each center will have its own ethical clearance process, and that has to be adhered to.
Yeah, or probably like, if I'm taking it from somewhere else, so will it pose a, so that again depends on if they agree to give you, and you will need ethics approval, yes, but then this is about if you're taking it from somewhere else, depends on that institution and things like that. And if you have that institution involved and they mandate that you need to get their ethics committee approval, because sometimes some institutions insist on that, then you might have to go through that as well.
regarding the clinicians in ICC, is it mandatory to have non-institutional clinicians?
No, nothing like non-institutional clinicians are mandated. It can be like anybody, but then it has to be like a clinician. And many a times, in fact, most of the institutions have a institutional clinician because they actually have it from either from their own or from a neighboring institute. Depends. As I said, it has to be 50% of the people from outside.
Examples of waiver.
For questionnaire-based study, 1 minute. For questionnaire-based study, say KAP on rabies. KAP is knowledge, attitude, and practice. Do we need IRC or IEC? Must. Yes, as I said, if you're doing a questionnaire-based study, just because it's a questionnaire-based study doesn't mean that you will be exempted, because you need to take an approval. And since you're going to distribute this questionnaire, collect data from the people, and as I told you, that falls under the ambit as per the ICMR guidelines. That yes, you're collecting data.
Again, there's a question on in case of studies involving child abuse, who should give consent other than the parents or the school teachers?
Now, this is like difficult to answer.
Again,
It's child abuse. Now, child abuse at the hands of whom? If you talk about child abuse at the hands of parents themselves, then obviously if you get consent or whatever, it will be a very difficult situation. If you're talking about child abuse at the hand of somebody else, or maybe so depends. It's very difficult to answer that without knowing the exact context and what exactly the person is wanting to know.
Okay, there's a question. If the study is new and there are no previous references available, will getting IEC approval become difficult? I don't think so. As long as you have adhered to all the ethical issues and
yes.
Yes.
Let me again once more, clarify that. Please understand, any kind of, whether it's a patient satisfaction or any questionnaire or anything, you need to take ethics committee approval. Just because it's a patient satisfaction or whatever, if you're planning it as a research, see, there's a difference. If in a hospital you're doing it for a feedback or something, that's a different thing. But the moment you want to do it as a research, and then you come out with analysis, and then you put up a presentation in a conference or publish it, then it becomes a research. So there you need ethics committee approval. So there is a difference between a research and a routine thing which you're doing as a part of hospital feedback.
There is a question on what about the online IEC meeting due to the current situation? Is it approved? It is approved to conduct. It has been approved by the ICMR itself for us to continue the review process and not to put on hold any study. So there is no
Not only that, there have been recent guidelines released a few days back, I think about 10 days or something back. They have released COVID times, they have released ICMR new small guidelines. They have about 20-25 pages. And many of the ICs are meeting. In fact, yesterday only we had our own IEC meeting online itself. So, there are many IECs which are meeting online, because in COVID times, that's what is the necessity.
It is not just the IEC, even the IRB, the Scientific Review Board, is also meeting online and reviewing the proposals in the present situation. So there is no issue with that at all.
Any other question that we have missed out? I think there was a question for Praveen. There was one question for Praveen from the last session. If there
was a question on the Mann-Whitney. Somebody was talking about what
Rajiv Chuk or somebody, I think, if I remember correctly.
I saw that question. I think I just need some clarity on the question. Can he unmute himself and ask the question?
I think it was Dr. Rajiv, right? Rajiv Chuk or something.
Rajiv.
Yeah, if he is there, can you please unmute yourself, Dr. Rajiv, and then.
Rajiv.
Yes. Yes, please clarify your question. Dr. Praveen is waiting to answer.
brief.
I think he's muting himself again and again.
Yeah, I think it's okay, maybe. Yeah. I think we've covered all this.
Regarding ORCID, somebody wanted to know. I've just put up. See, ORCID only you can have a ORCID. This thing basically it's a unique thing to you. And many times what happens is like Animesh Jain, Ajay Jain, and all that. So sometimes there might be confusion. So if I put up that, and then every time if I and some journals now look for an ORCID ID, or if I have all the publications, so ORCID can group it together for me, and then that's also linked to Scopus. The other thing is, it's unique to me, so it becomes much easier to track everything, and it's a unique identifier in a way. Many of the even the ranking agencies are looking at it, and many of the institutions, higher institutions and universities, good universities, are insisting on this. So it's good to you can have your ORCID ID yourself. You can create one for yourself. Just go to that site and you could do that. It's a Elsevier thing. It's linked to Scopus as well.
There's a question about collecting data through Google Form. If it is not mentioned already in the protocol, but later the person wants to connect, can it be done, or do they require a permission?
So what do you mean by it was not mentioned earlier? That means you had not mentioned that you will be collecting through Google Forms. So you can always inform your IEC saying that now we would like to go for, and then again you would need to say that how it will be, and then your ideally like what I have done personally also, I put up that Google form, and then you share that link also with your IEC, so that if they want to, they can have a look at that. And of course your whatever that in the Google form you're putting up also should be put up in the protocol as well, and then they will review and they will decide on that. And please ensure that in the Google form also you make all the things known in the first itself, including all those elements of the consent, because there is a section on electronic consent in the ICMR document, and most of the things what she has talked about, Rashmi has talked about in the consent, they have to be there, and including there has to be that I've understood, I've read and understood, and you have to click on agree and then only proceed. So until and unless they do that, they should not be proceeding to answer a questionnaire. And then you should also mention if not the contact number, at least the contact details in the form of the email IDs and of the investigator as well as the IEC.
See, if there is any change in the protocol at any point in the study, say you add a Google form, or you change the duration of the study, or you change the sample size, you want to add another because you've finished, reached the sample size that you wanted within much earlier in the study. So to increase the power of the study, you plan to add on to the sample size, whatever it is. You have to send an email to the institutional ethics committee and take their permission, and they will approve it, and then only continue with it. And if there is anything, there is something called as on-site monitoring that they do of each and every study. The ethics committee will be doing it. So if they find that there is any protocol violation, like that is there is any violation in the protocol from which you have originally submitted, they have every right to stop the study. So, so whether it is an online survey or whatever, you need to inform the IEC and take approval.
Okay, there's one more question I'll take up. Prithvi Shetty had asked earlier. So what is the difference between active and passive consent? So I'll just quickly give you I think I got.
Dr.
Hello.
Animesh, you got muted.
Yeah, I can. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay, so in case of active consent, I don't think I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. You are audible.
All right. So, for example, if I'll repeat the example which I gave earlier also. If a study is being done about, let's say, some health education thing in a school, a consent form is given, and the participants, the children are told to get that form back, taking permission or consent from the parents that they can participate in the study. That's an active consent. Sometimes some researchers say that if the child will participate in the study, unless you don't want your child to participate, then send the form back. So it's like passively you're consenting for that. So these are some of the things which are done, especially when you're doing research in a larger group, and just wanting to give it like questionnaire studies and all. So types of consent which are used.
There is a question, sir, coming up, I think repeatedly. The question is on if you are doing an interventional study and giving health education to a control group and a study group, is it an ethical way of doing it?
No.
See, again, I'll answer it a little differently rather than saying just yes or no. And Praveen can add because it comes a little under our domain also, community medicine. So, see, the thing is, health education and, intervention in the form of health education is acceptable. And please let me, before I answer that, let me also tell you all these health education interventional studies also can go into CTRI. You can do that. We've registered such trials, and please, you can do that. It becomes, there are many advantages of that. I will not go into that right now. But the other thing is, ideally, if you think that the health education, the premise is obviously that health education is going to benefit. So you need to compare, and that's why you will have two groups. So you can have, depending on the design, you can either have parallel or crossover. But if you're not having a crossover, at least try to give that health education intervention in the end, after you completed your data collection and all, to the other group also. Okay, so don't deny them that benefit. That's what I would like to suggest, so that at least in the end the other group also gets that benefit. It's something like in a way placebo, or something which you think that you're denying them. Praveen, you can add if you want to.
The same thing with an educational intervention also. If you are dividing students into two groups, and you're giving a particular intervention to one group and to the other group, you're not giving an equivalent intervention, or it is less than that, you will have to repeat that particular intervention to the other group also after completing your data collection.
Yeah, Animesh sir, absolutely. I was typing the same thing, but we discussed it. And there is one kind of a problem that may arise sometime when we do the studies at the community level. What happens is you have two groups. One is a study group and a control group, say two different villages. And in one village, I'm giving an intervention, and incidentally, a person from the other village will also come and he wants to attend my session. At that point in time, sending him back is unethical. We need to include him, and we have to give education, because I have faced this situation when I was doing in my MD. As you told, we have to give the same intervention to the group at the end.
Yes, we cannot deny.
Yeah, if someone enters in between and he wants to have to be a part of the intervention, then we should not let him go. This is one I just wanted.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Any other question which has been unanswered, Praveen, Vijay, or Rashmi? Anything that, because somehow in between I just logged out, so I missed out on the previous chat. Now it's not there in my, so I don't know. I'm getting chat only after I logged back in. I was answering questions and suddenly I got disconnected.
Yeah, Dr. Purnima is asking. Purnima is from US.
Okay.
Dr. Purnima is asking, can the speakers talk a bit more about consent and assent?
Okay, just to briefly touch on, see, assent is usually for child participants. So any child participant, and in India, as per the ICMR guidelines, it will be for any child between 7 years to 18 years of age. So if you're involving any, you need to have an assent. Now, what is the difference between the consent and assent? Assent is for children, obviously, one. Second, it has to be simpler, in a much easier way to understand, for a child to understand. You will have almost everything which is there in that, but be simpler. Why they should take part, what is the benefit, can they deny I'm taking part, all that. Then the other thing is, even if you're taking an assent, you still have to take consent from the parent or legally authorized representative. That's a must. Now, please also understand, it's an all or none phenomenon. So you have a consent from parent, no assent from the child. You cannot proceed. You have assent from the child, you do not have consent from the parent. You cannot proceed. So it has to be all, like both assent and consent. Both of them should have been given. So those two things should be tick marked. The other thing is, another thing is that if you think that for something the child is not agreeing, you try to address, make them understand, and you might have to sometimes repeat it. One more thing, let me tell you, in India, as per the guidelines, 7 years to 12 years, you need oral, whereas 12 to 18, you need a written assent. So this is just in brief. I think that should suffice for now. Online studies in various countries, so I have a doubt if they need separate ethical committee from, again, depends. Now, if there are no other investigators from the other country, then I do not know how, like, what do you mean? But
No,
otherwise,
I think she's referring to online surveys that we.
online survey, I understand. But what I'm saying is, if I have investigators also from those countries, then, and if their institution also feels, and there are depending on that. But if I am the one who's doing it, for example, and I am doing it and I'm doing it online and I'm sending it across to the world through my different channels, I may not have any other hold on any other ethics committee, or I may not be able to go to their ethics committees or whatever, right? So that's something which is I think which I can tell you.
See, such studies can be done so long as you do not gather and disseminate information such as their cultural practices or any private information which may lead to them being discriminated or subject to any other kind of harassment. The information that you disseminate should be collect and disseminate should be such that they are not subject to any form of harassment. So it should not make the participants through your online survey should not make participants vulnerable by virtue of their country, race, religion, culture, whatever background they come from. So in such a situation, you can go ahead and do the study. But at any point of time, if you collect data which is going to be this one, then it will create an issue.
Just to add, even when we are doing studies, say for example, even in, say, if I'm doing in Mangalore, for example, and I do it among 3 or 4 institutions after taking the IEC and then taking appropriate approvals from the regulatory, bodies of their institutes or the heads of institutions and things like that, and take appropriate consent. When I publish or when I share the data, I don't have to say that this institution by name or whatever, because that again is, and especially if it's sensitive things. So that's also very, very important. Any other thing that is I'm not very sure on that. I think there's a question from Vinita Pai ma'am. What about informed dissent? Is it mandatory if the person is not willing to take treatment or participate in a study? I'm not too sure. There is a dissent, but I'm not sure if I believe that again that can be like I'm understanding that this is something like the person is saying that I don't want to undergo this treatment or something. So should that be documented?
See, refusal to participate in the study doesn't need an informed dissent, because in that informed consent form itself, there is a mention that I do not wish to participate in the study, and it can be. But if the patient is refusing any form of treatment, then that comes under a separate this one, where we need to document refusal of treatment. That dissent has to be documented. If it's a new form of treatment that is being given as part of that particular research, then it's part of the informed consent process, the person can refuse. But already acceptable treatment, if the patient is refusing, that also has to be documented.
Yeah, it's a reverse negative.
So just to tell you, many people are asking for the recording and all. All these sessions are recorded. Already the 5 sessions that have happened have already been put up on YouTube channel of Sahasra ENT Foundation. So you can get link, and then Dr. Sriyasha can share the link of the playlist also. So all of those are available, and you can always go through that, and then you can always have it there. So I think
Animesh, there's one last question again from Vinita ma'am.
Yeah.
She's asking the same. I mean, I think it's a continuation of the same question. What about children 7 to 18 years? If they refuse participating in a study, or if they refuse treatment, and the parent wants to give the treatment to that particular child, research participation, again, if they refuse, they cannot be included. But if it is about treating a particular illness, it is about weighing the risk versus harm and taking the parents, because the parent is also subjected to quite a bit of distress if their child is sick, and giving the treatment. Depends upon the
Yes.
nature of illness again.
Yeah, life-saving
But-
things, it can be done. For
But-
life-saving things, even if a child is not consenting, it can be done. But for the purpose of research, like Dr. Animesh said, it's all or none. Both have to agree. So if it's life-saving procedures, it's different thing. Otherwise, yeah, that's the only exception. If it's life-saving thing.
Say if a
Otherwise,
child, if a child is brought to me for tonsillectomy, and the parents insist that the child is getting recurrent sore throats, please take away the tonsil, and the child says, no, the sore throat is not bothering me much, I don't want to undergo the surgery. Still the parent is saying the child is missing school every now and then for the sore throat, please do the tonsillectomy. I cannot do that study, and there do a study. I can't do the treatment also. In fact, the child's willingness is important in that situation. 7 to 18 years, I mean.
Right, so I think it's already time. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sriharsha, Dr. Vijayalakshmi, Praveen, Rashmi, and all the